I'm Harvey Mansfield. This is the program on constitutional government and our fall series, the first of our fall series. And we've got a speaker today, young man, Sohrab Ahmari from Iran, who's going to talk about Iran. He's an assistant editor at the Wall Street Journal, recent graduate of Northeastern Law School, and a very successful writer for important conservative magazines. And I think you even got something in the New Republic. Is that right?
Occasionally.
Occasionally.
Rarely. But only on their website.
Say occasionally. Not just once or even twice, but not often.
Right.
Right. All right. And he's going to talk about Iran, 30 years of a failed engagement policy. Is that correct? Something like, I think I've got it. So, please go ahead, and we'll listen carefully, and then we might have a question or two at the end.
Well, I want to start by thanking Professor Mansfield and Shep and Andy and everyone else at the program on constitutional government for having me, and thank you all for coming on this rainy Friday. So I really am thrilled to be here. I hope not to take more than 20 minutes, and then have a discussion. As Professor Mansfield mentioned, I'm not a nuclear strategist or a military strategist. What I am, I'm a journalist. I happen to have been born in Iran and raised there till I was 13, and then I moved to the U.S. And I take a special interest in Iran issues and read about what happens in the country, both in the obviously English-speaking media, but also the Persian blogosphere, which is very vibrant, as you may know, when I can. But I mean, this is the most important national security issues facing the U.S. as was mentioned more than a few times at the debate last night. The title of my talk is 30 Years of Failed Engagement. And the reason for that title is the fact that when President Obama came into office, his big promise on Iran, not only on Iran, but a number of other rogue regimes, was to reach out to leaders that previously we had failed to engage in dialogue. So immediately upon coming into office, he had the interview with Al Arabiya. Soon after, he'd had the speech to the Muslim world with a capital W in Cairo. And part of that, a huge part of that engagement effort was the reach out to Iran's leaders. And very early on, they came in the form of these YouTube videos filmed in wherever in the White House, where the president would sit and address Iran's leaders and its people. And he made he would quote Persian poetry in these to congratulate Iranians, in the country and in the Persian diaspora on the Persian New Year. And there were subtle messages that Iran watchers immediately picked up on, like the fact that the president would always say, the Islamic Republic of Iran has a chance to join the Community of Nations. And that was a very obvious thing, because previously rarely had presidents spelled out the full name of the regime. And the idea was that this is a new day. The idea of trying to promote democratization in Iran and to overthrow the regime are over. And we accept the mullah's legitimacy. So it's a matter of coming to some mutually agreeable terms on regional differences, chief among them the nuclear dossier, but also support for domestic terrorism. And of course, human rights was very much off the table. There was not one mention of human rights, democracy in that first speech. And then in 2009, in the summer, there was the election in Iran, which was questions were immediately raised about whether or not it was fraudulent. People poured into the streets. And as Congressman Ryan pointed out, the Obama administration essentially didn't say anything for 9 days because this movement that had occurred in Iran was seen as an inconvenience for this broader engagement policy, which was very much leader to leader. We're not sure what's going on the ground, and anywho, we're not going to take sides. And believe it or not, in the 2010 video broadcast on the Persian New Year, this is a year after we had seen the brutal crackdown, we had seen the YouTube videos of a young woman shot in the streets of Tehran, the president still said, the Islamic Republic of Iran can have mutual respect and mutual understanding, as though he was still talking to a regime that was, by all intents and purposes legitimate, just like Assad, who was a reformer. They might be a little creepy in how they treat their own people, but let's make a deal here. And believe it or not, it's continued to this day. In other words, if you look at the YouTube video that was released in 2012, it's clear the president it's become much more difficult for the president to be as optimistic as he sounded in the earlier videos, and he does condemn Iran's human rights violations, its support for terrorism in much starker and robust terms. But at the end of the day, he says there's still an opportunity for Iran's mullahs, who we've just seen brutalize their own people, to join the community of responsible nations. And I think the president and his cohort are convinced that what he's doing is this remarkable overturning of how America does its foreign policy. All his predecessors were these, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, were these, hawkish, heartless people who didn't realize that, you could solve differences through dialogue, and that he represents something radically new. Just by the sheer force of his personality, his willingness to sit down and have beer summits, or I guess we couldn't have that with the Iranian leaders, but you get the idea that that all differences between nations and between leaders are matters of mutual misunderstanding that can be solved through dialogue. So what I hope to argue today, in the remainder of my time, is that in fact engagement has gone on for about 30 years. That every administration since President Carter's, which had to deal with the Iranian revolution in 1979 and the aftermath, the hostage crisis, has in fact tried to engage in the hope of reaching some agreement with moderates within the Tehran regime, who can be brought back into the fold of responsible powers and achieve some sort of modus vivendi with Iran's leaders. And in each time they've failed. In other words, the engagement policy is nothing new, and it was never never any more effective than we saw over the past 4 years, where Iran continues to race towards nuclear weapons. It continues to repress its people, and it continues to sponsor terror abroad. In other words, there hasn't been any progress over the past 4 years, nor in the preceding 3 or so decades. And we can go through all the various engagement efforts. Not to give a presidential history lesson, but with Carter, you had early on when the revolution happened, you had members of the Carter administration saying Khomeini is some kind of a saint, and he'll be remembered as such. And as soon as the revolution happened, the signal sent that we are willing to work with this new regime, even though there were quite crazy and messianic and hysterical things going on within Iran, like perfectly educated people claiming to have seen Khomeini's image on the moon, because that's how much the revolutionary leader, how beloved the revolutionary leader was. That should have been a signal that there's something terrible going on in Iran, and yet the immediate approach was to try to dump the Shah, who, for good or ill, we had worked with for some 3 decades, and he wasn't allowed to, one of these obvious diplomatic signals, he wasn't allowed to get hospital care in the U.S. because he had cancer, And we forced him to. Eventually, when he was allowed in, thanks to some congressional pressure and the personal intercession of Henry Kissinger, the Shah had to use a side door at Mount Sinai Hospital as a sign of how unwelcome he is in the U.S. And this was the first engagement effort, right? And it was in the way that the radical Islamists in Tehran responded to it was with the hostage crisis. President Reagan came in, sounding much tougher on Tehran. But as the story that you all well know, in fact, behind the scenes, there were all these hopes. In fact, many of the Reagan Cold Warriors thought that the way to help defeat the Soviet Union was in part to bring the mullahs into the Western sphere, and the big fear was that they would go communist, which was never going to happen because these are medievalist Islamists. They're not ever to be tempted by Marxism or dialectical materialism, but that was the idea, and so we sent them arms when they were fighting with Iraq, first through Israel and then directly. We sent Bob McFarlane, one of President Reagan's national security advisors, and he took with him a key-shaped cake, as some of you may know the story, and a copy of the Good Book. And again, they responded with hostage takings, and the hostages that they did hold at the time were released, but then they were replaced with new hostages. Now we're talking about hostages in Lebanon, by the way, not the embassy hostages. Go up to President Bush Sr. His promise was that goodwill begets goodwill. That's what he said in his inaugural speech upon coming into office to Tehran. Goodwill begets goodwill. The Iran-Iraq war is over. There's now an opportunity for Iran to join the fold of responsible nations. And he was so hopeful about this idea that, in fact, as a new book by David Krist reveals, that I think is very worthwhile reading, and that I reviewed for the journal, it's called The Twilight War. And one of the big revelations in it that President George H.W. Bush sat on the phone for half an hour with someone he thought was Iran's then newly elected president, Rafsanjani. And in fact, it turned out to be a prank call. So but goodwill begets goodwill, and that he spoke with this guy for half an hour. President Clinton came in and he apologized. That his way of engaging was to apologize for the coup that had happened in Iran in 1953 that toppled, the prime minister who nationalized Iranian oil. It's strange why he would do that, why he would apologize to the clerics, because actually the clerics had supported the overthrow of the prime minister at the time in 1953. But again, so and meanwhile, what's going on? The Khobar Towers, what was going on during the 80s, the bombing of the barracks in Beirut, the Marine barracks in Beirut that killed more. It was the biggest sort of single attack on the Marines since World War II. And then George W. Bush, right? And everyone remembers him classifying Iran, I would say rightly, as part of an axis of evil along with Iraq and North Korea. And yet, through much of the administration, especially during the last 4 years, the George W. Bush administration was forced, in part because of the circumstances in Iraq, to make Iran into a regional partner because they needed their help. They thought they needed their help in Afghanistan, and more especially in Iraq, where Iran has quite a bit of influence over the country's Shia majority. As I write in my piece for commentary this month, this was the biggest geopolitical case of asking the fox to watch the henhouse, because to ask a regime that is inherently anti-American and anti-Western, that has as its project trying to destabilize the American order in the Middle East to try to help stabilize the Middle East is quite the folly, I would submit. So here we are. And then we get to the Obama administration, and the promise is that I'll sit down with any leader without preconditions to resolve our differences, as though that had not happened for the 3 decades preceding that. And each time these overtures were met by sometimes some amount of obfuscation, some amount of these false openings, but then always at the same time an uptick in terror, either whether it's in Argentina, whether it's in Europe, whether it's kidnappings in Lebanon, or whether during the past 4 years it's attempting to assassinate a Saudi ambassador in Washington, and so on and so forth. So the argument that I hope to have made to you is that this idea of engaging in Iran is, first of all, not new, and the burden is on those who say that these reconciliatory gestures represent a path to solving the U.S.-Iran conflict, and what I hope to have shown is that it does not. But I'll stop there and open it up for questions, because I believe I've spoken for just about 20 minutes. Yeah.
I have a little question that grows out of the debate last night. I figured if anyone would know, you would know. Several times the Vice President said that Iran has no nuclear delivery capability. It's my impression that, to the contrary, Iran has a sophisticated arsenal of ballistic missiles. Which is it?
Well, they do have their missile arsenal. I wasn't sure what the Vice President was talking about. I don't know if it's the nuclear, like whether they've made the decision to turn the screw on a warhead, to have a warhead. That's the big debate, right? Whether or not they have done so, and if they have not, whether or not our intelligence community is well placed to be able to predict that. One of the Obama administration's central principles on this issue, and you heard it from the Vice President, is because he said it with absolute certainty, is we will know. Once they make that decision, we will know. And the question is, why should we? Because we've actually been surprised. I mean, other governments, both friendly like Israel and more ambiguous like India, and crazed failed states like Pakistan, have turned the screw and surprised us. And then there's North Korea, a totalitarian, psychotic state. So that tells you something about our ability to know when that turning of the screw happens. And it amazes me that the Vice President said with such certainty that we will know. Yeah.
A couple of questions. First, at the beginning, you said that indicated that Obama's position was really dictated by his kind of naive understanding of foreign policy, desire to substitute rhetoric for action. But then you basically said that everyone else has been doing this too. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of, do you really want to say this is kind of something unique to Obama that reflected his worldview? My second question is, if you make a convincing claim that trying to engage and reform hasn't worked, but then you want to look at what other things, number one, presidents have done, and what else they could do. So my kind of how would you respond to the claim that, well, presidents have done a lot of other things underneath the rhetoric, especially sanctions, mm-hmm. and trying to isolate Iran, and that these haven't been only partially successful because our options are so limited. Mm-hmm. You seem to indicate there was some option that was put off the table because of the poorly informed strategy they've used. Mm-hmm. So could you say something about what options they might have considered?
So let me start with the second question,
okay.
Only because I just formulated a response to it. As far as options, let me begin by saying what I think the U.S.-Iran conflict is about. I think the U.S.-Iran conflict is an ideological conflict. In other words, it's primarily about a state that refuses to accept what the reigning world order is, which is a broadly liberal world order led by the world's sole superpower. It just refuses to accept that, and in fact, it believes that the worldview that it represents is an alternative, at least starting out in the region, that may work in the region. It's a great point to digress here because, you might say, well, they're authoritarian, but so are the status quo type Arab powers like Saudi Arabia, most notably, or the Gulf monarchies, or Jordan, or the like. But I would say that those regimes are they're obviously status quo powers. They're basically in the American fold, and B, there's a difference between their sort of petty autocracy, authoritarianism, and Iran's quasi-totalitarian, sort of messianic, visionary type Islamism, and so the point of this is that the conflict is ideological, and we have only tried to solve it through either diplomatic or economic means. In other words, we're proposing diplomatic and economic problems to what's fundamentally. So what could other presidents have done? I think that very early on after the revolution, it became clear that large masses of Iranians had become disillusioned with what they had done. In other words, they looked back in 1979 and realized this was a fit of national hysteria. And so, I mean, what I would do at that point, and I think it's still maybe a solution, is to constantly try to undermine the regime, to promote regime change, which it's never been done in a systematic way, in a clever way. Our propaganda is actually really clunky compared to what the Iranian regime puts out. They're actually very sophisticated in how they message different things, especially to people in the region, and we've never been able to get that mix right. So now, the range of options is now narrowing. In other words, I think that I personally, this is my personal prediction, and I may be wrong. You might check, Google News or whatever in 2 hours, and I've been proven wrong because the Israeli planes have been spotted over Iranian airspace. I don't think there's going to be an Israeli military intervention, and I personally don't think there will be an American one. So I think the Iranians are going to get a nuclear bomb, and now we're going into the containment scenario, unless we manage to find some creative way out of it. So that I hope is a big picture answer to your question. Is what else could they have tried? What for a while was being promoted as the third way between full-on military confrontation and this sort of engage and contain was to try to systematically promote regime change. And there was a grand opportunity that came up in 2009 that I believe was wasted. To answer your other question, what I meant by how Obama's different is both the domestic electoral trappings and let me be frank here. It's the obnoxious, like him sitting in a White House in front of a camera and say, I'm here to engage you, and we both have long histories. These sort of obvious, but cliche things that he's fun. This sort of gesture politics, right? We've had prior presidents try to engage Russia before, but only President Obama and his team will take a stupid button to the Russians and say, here's our reset button. So that's what I mean, and how he's different is this sort of, the marketing sheen that's put on things. But you're right. I mean, I think, in fact, that's my argument, is that he's not doing much that's different from prior presidents, despite the differences in rhetoric. I mean, George W. Bush was incredibly hawkish during his first term, not so much in his last four. I hope that answers.
Thank you.
Let me start here.
Questions for you also. One, how do you see U.S. policy, U.S. engagement with Iran differing if there hadn't been an invasion of Iraq in 2003?
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, what do you see as the likely result of the new Israeli elections coming up vis-a-vis their policy toward Iran?
And let me start with the second one. I'm not a really close follower of Israeli domestic politics. I think I get the impression that Prime Minister Netanyahu has a really one of the most stable governments in Israeli history as someone who's not an expert. And so I don't think Israeli policy will change given what happens. And I guess he called for an election in 3 months, right? I'm not sure. I don't think there would be any policy discontinuity. the first question was, oh, what would have happened had Iraq not been done? Look, I think people really discount the. I mean, there's this very, people think, opponents of the Bush administration, that it's this really clever argument, like, but you didn't think what invading Iraq would do to Iran, did you? And as though, I mean, these people weren't idiots. They thought about it, and they still said it's in U.S. national security interest, given what we knew, or we thought we knew about Iranian or Iraqi weapons programs, to topple Saddam. I think some things that have unsettled the Iranians, thanks to the invasion of Iraq, is the sight of a Middle Eastern dictator falling and his statue being torn down. I mean, Iranians might say consciously that they think it's terrible and it's a U.S. aggression, but unconsciously this image has been implanted of these guys aren't that strong. You know, they're mere mortals. And here's another thing that I think, if we end up doing the containment route, as I believe, unfortunately, we're heading towards, having had that presence of U.S. troops in Iraq would have been helpful in enforcing a containment regime, because one of the biggest things that you need when you want to contain a regime is literally to geographically box it in, and we were in a very good shape to do that had we had a huge military force in Iraq and in Afghanistan. In fact, this is one of the reasons where folks on the realist side or liberals who say, "Oh, it's okay, we'll just contain the regime." One of the big things that they miss is that you need, as I understand it, and containment theory. Some of you who are in it is incredibly. There are variations of it, and you know how you read Kennan. I won't go into the weeds, but more or less, what you need is, one, you need a framework of stable alliances that you can use to help enforce the containment regime. You need the troops, or essentially the military troops and hardware that you deploy and you're willing to use if the regime you're trying to contain crosses certain red lines. And third, you need something I would call a balance of terror between you and the regime that you're trying to contain. And if you go down that list, and I'm digressing a bit from your Iraq question, those are three things we don't have. So as I mentioned, we're actually redeploying our troops away from the region. So that idea that we have troops to enforce a containment regime is hard to live up to. The second is the fact that as far as stable military alliances, in fact, the Arab world is the order that we relied on is kind of going upside down. I mean, look at what Libya looks like. Look at what Egypt looks like. And by the way, I'm happy about some of these developments, because I think that old order needed to be reformed, and had we pushed reform with our friendly autocrats, maybe we wouldn't be in this place. But we don't have that, basically. I mean, we do, but it's shaken. Our order is shaken. And the last thing is to have a regime that you can strike a balance of terror with. In other words, if they cross a red line, you're willing to intervene militarily, and know that the threat is enough for them to, the deterrent is enough for them to back down. And yet with Iran, you have a regime that exalts in terror. So it's very hard to convince them to back down. I'm not saying if they had a nuclear weapon, once they turn the screw, tomorrow there'll be a mushroom cloud over somewhere in Saudi Arabia or over Tel Aviv. But the problem is, something, let's say, happens in Bahrain, which Iran has always, even before this regime, has had sort of national claims to. And now, and it's also a Shia majority country ruled by a sort of one of these typical kleptocratic, Sunni monarchies. Let's say something happens, and by the way, it's home to the U.S. Fifth Fleet. It's the next uprising in Bahrain, and the Iranians say we want to stand up for our Shia brethren. They move in troops or whatever. it's their slight more likelihood to be crazy that'll make us back down. So there's a slightly, it's much more likely with them than, say, the Soviets, because they do have this messianic element in the worldview. So I hope that's a good question, or that's a good answer to your question. But I mean, as far as that counterfactual of what would have happened differently, I think it's very hard to answer. Yeah, Andy.
I'd like to ask you about demography and opinion.
Mm-hmm.
How supported by the regime are the Iranian people today? We see the young people in 2009. Do we have any idea of the percentage of support for their uprising?
I would say, well, there's a number that some people, and I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but there are people who say that between 3 to 10 million Iranians support the regime. And the 3 million are genuine ideological supporters, and that there's this broader core of people who, you know, they benefit from the regime one way or another. They're okay with it staying. The way I would put it, and this was described to me by a very smart Iran watcher, but he's just an Iranian American. He's not a professional Iran watcher, but that, let's say that's that 3 to 10 million, and then you have within the big urban centers probably about as many of people who are, you know, actively opposed to the regime or want some sort of radical change, not just reforming the Iranian constitution, but radical change. Let's say those two balance out, and then you have this big middle ground of people who are, you know, of people who in any country don't really care that much about the regime that rules over them. They're just, you know, they just want to live. And so the question is, the next time, if there is hopefully an uprising, it's whether or not which direction those people in the middle go.
Do we know about the support for the U.S. and the West? I mean, does it mesh exactly with what you're describing? People who support the regime, obviously, not in favor of the West, but then the people who are against the regime, are they in favor of the West in general?
I could give you anecdotal examples. I mean, it depends on which sort of Iranian milieu there are people in the you know, upper middle class, urban educated class who consider themselves some form of liberal, or they call themselves Democrats. They even have the vocabulary. Who also you know, anecdotally you'll come across Iranians who sound very pro-Western or pro-American. I don't know what the number is, but what I will say is, one of the tragedies of the Arab Spring for me personally, because I was one of the people who thought this is terrific. I published an anthology on the Arab Spring about Arab liberals rising, and here's the answer: neither the kleptocratic autocrats nor the Islamists, the young secular Democrat, will make a huge difference. And one of the big disappointments was, I don't know if we weren't listening closely enough to them or whether they were disguising their views, was that a lot of the people who called themselves liberals, they didn't even quite know what that means, but especially on their views on geopolitics, it's almost the same as the Islamists. In other words, they are as or more vehemently anti-Israel and anti-American as the other guys. So, and what I would say is that my personal belief, not based on much than what I think I know my own native homeland and anecdotal evidence, is that there are likely more Iranians who call themselves liberals or Democrats who are fed up with the regime, who also happen to share a pro-Western worldview, at least more than there were Arabs, for what it's worth. Yeah.
Well, I just want to kind of maybe throw something out there. I think that, and then hear what your reaction to this is. I think that your characteristic of American engagement and our history with Iran is perhaps maybe a little simplistic, in the sense that, and I would disagree. I don't think that after the revolution it was clear necessarily that Khomeini was going to come to power, and in a sense engagement was the right thing to do. You know, I mean, you had Bazargani, for example, who was the who had power, and kind of tried to share it with Khomeini for a while. There was a chance that Bazargani was going to set up a kind of more secular, still Islamically based, but still kind of a more liberal, in our sense of liberal regime. And these figures like Bazargani come up periodically, with Khatami and with other figures, throughout this regime. And when they emerge, it seems like, engagement is the right thing to do in a sense, because you don't want to shut them down. Iran, even within the Islamic religious establishment of Iran, is incredibly diverse. It's a principle. We always hear about the Grand Ayatollah, but the Grand Ayatollah is one of, tens, if not hundreds, of Ayatollahs. And then there are other marjas, which is the rank just underneath Ayatollah. And according to the dogma of Shiism, not one Ayatollah can interfere in the affairs of another. And so, and we've seen this with many Ayatollahs in the past 10 years that have come out opposing Khomeini for various number of reasons. And so, I think that if you take too hard a stance against Iran, and you don't enter in these kinds of engagement, then you can potentially wind up reinforcing the regime. And I think that's what's actually happened with George Bush and some of his stances toward Iran. I think that's part of the reason why the country galvanized behind Ahmadinejad, particularly when we rebuffed Iran's offer of help when we invaded Afghanistan in 2001, as brusquely as we did. Because as I'm sure you know, the Iranians, as a country, are incredibly opposed to anyone involving themselves in their affairs. Every uprising against the government for the last, 100+ years. Revolution in 1906, 1907, the Constitutional Revolution in 1911, the uprising against Mossadegh, and then the uprising against the Shah were all direct result of foreign intervention, openly in Iranian internal affairs. So I guess maybe my question to you would be, with this in mind, what kind of engagement are you talking about? Because to engage toward a regime change, if you want to do that, how would we avoid pressing everyone back to supporting the regime that's currently in power rather than the regime that's coming from the outside?
Well, there's a lot packed into what you said, and a lot of assumptions that I don't share. So let me take them one by one. Under Shia dogma, it's true that Shiism doesn't have a pope. So there's sources of emulation, right? So you reach the status of being a really learned Ayatollah, and you can have the privilege of issuing fatwas and having people become your followers. And there's a great deal of independence in this. But the Iranian regime is not actually that. It doesn't adhere. It calls itself an Islamic Republic. Its trappings are very traditionalist, but in fact it's a modernist enterprise. It's a modern sort of fascistic enterprise. So yeah, they're not allowed to interfere with other clerics, but there's Ayatollah Brujerdi, who's actually quite learned, and who said, essentially called for separation of mosque and state. And Khamenei, most definitely, that's the current supreme leader, most definitely interfered with his personal affairs because he's in Evin prison. So I wouldn't use the Orthodox Shia stuff as an excuse for the regime, or or fall for it as an illusion. And then there's also the fact that I think we tend to exoticize Iran. Right, so about this issue, I don't know if you heard, but one big story that emerged about a year ago about the nuclear dossier was the fact that supposedly Ayatollah Khamenei had issued a fatwa, a religious edict banning nuclear weapons in 1995, supposedly. First of all, no record of it could be found. But it's true, an Ayatollah can issue both a written or a verbal or oral fatwa. So let's assume that he did. It's the most absurd thing. There's also a fatwa. There's a commandment, whatever you want to call it, in Islam that says, you shouldn't rape people, right? But they use rape as a form of torture. So what I'm saying is, why is it that if there's something that has a religious or Arabic sounding trapping to it, it's like, we have a lot of reasons based on the way they've behaved vis-a-vis the International Atomic Energy Agency and other reasons to suspect that they're actually striving for a bomb. Oh, but yeah, he issued a fatwa. Like a fatwa. Because if you're a leader of a dictatorial regime, you're going to do anything. Sometimes you're going to draw on the trappings of your tradition, and sometimes you're going to discard it. And in fact, there's a great guy named Mehdi Khalaji at the Washington Institute who's actually a former theologian. He studied for 16 years in Qom, which is the center of Shia learning. And one of the things he'll tell you is that these guys who run Iran, they've given themselves the right to, the fatwa communicated publicly, but will act the opposite because preserving the state matters more. So I would downplay that issue. And then this issue of interference, here's how I'd put it. If I'm Iranian and I speak to Iranian students inside the country, who, by the way, in 2009, one of their slogans was, Obama, you've probably heard this, you're either with us or with them, right? They chanted that, the video's on YouTube. It's quite moving. So essentially, what I would say is, there's this argument that whenever there's dissidents, if we speak up in their support, we'll somehow taint them. As long as there's been dissidents in Iran for the past 30 years, they've been called, Zionist stooges and blah, 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 blah. But, they still come out. It's just, the similar lines of argument were put forth with respect to the Soviet Union. If you don't speak up for the dissidents, because that'll make their situation worse. Whereas in fact we did for Soviet Jewry and others, because wherever there are people who are crying out for freedom, the U.S. is implicated no matter what, and those people are always going to be called stooges of the West or whatever. But that's how it is. That's part of the battle. But that doesn't absolve us of standing up for them. I hope there was more that you mentioned, but I wanted to hit those two big things of this issue of whether support for dissidents will constitute intervention in their affairs and have a nationalist backlash. Yeah.
I guess my big question is, it seems like both Obama and Bush and everyone, actually going back to Carter, even while we were trying to do these low-level engagements with Iran, and you're right, we actually have constantly been doing low-level engagements with Iran since 1979. Every time, even while we're attempting to do that, I think the official rhetoric of the United States government is pro-regime, not necessarily, if not explicitly pro-regime change, pro-democracy in Iran. So I think that we're doing that. So what more would you suggest that we do other than saying that we support a more democratic Iran?
Well, first of all, that's not been our rhetoric. Our rhetoric has always been directed at the regime. It's only probably in the George W. Bush administration that we started saying anything about freedom and democracy. Actually, I would challenge you to find. We always said we want Iran to join the fold, right, or come back to the whatever. This sort of talk about becoming a responsible power, but there wasn't much talk of it. And what can we do the next time there is an uprising? It would help if the leader of the free world didn't sit quiet for 9 days and then say, well, we don't know what's going on and it's not our policy to interfere, as there's rape camps and this sort of thing being set up in the country. Yeah.
Could I ask you about the Iranian community here? Because I entirely agree with your analysis, particularly in the beginning of this an ideological conflict. But the very word conflict is increasingly problematic in this society. And you saw it in the debate last night when the weakest moment of Paul Ryan's is when he could not bring himself to say anything about a strong defense going to war, because there's such a negative that has been built up, including where we sit, where there's been for 40 years you weren't allowed to, have ROTC on the campus.
4 students a year who were an ROTC. So the culture of anti-militarism and anti-conflict and so on is so strong. My real question to you is, what about the American-Iranian community? I mean, there's a very small thing, but there at least, where you would think that they would have something at stake. Is there any rhetoric? Is there any sense of being able to come out and say, yes, this is an ideological conflict, and somehow or other, rhetorically, I mean, choose your weapons, but let's face it, that we have to understand that that's what's involved. Is there anything like that? Is there anyone like you?
Let me start with the bigger point, which is the idea that's taken hold that you can be a superpower, you can stand for a set of ideas but not get into conflict, right? That you won't have enemies. There's no such thing as enmity. It's just people just need to sit down. I mean, this stuff is it's taking hold, and it's partly, I think, a backlash to what happened with Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which I personally supported. But I mean, this idea is, but I think that's an enormous cultural problem. And in fact, on campuses, it's incredibly difficult to overcome. So I mean, I applaud those who try to do it on campus, but it's very difficult. But it's great that Harvard has an ROTC program again. But as far as the Iranian American community, it's a very fractious diaspora community. There's a big generational fault line between people who tend to have come here right after the revolution, and who either were associated with the former regime or were the Shah's regime, or were one part of the other opposition factions that lost out to Khomeini. And so therefore these people are mostly having an intra-communal discussion. Their issue is what happened in 1953, what happened in 1979, and they're still fighting between whether it was the left's fault or the Shah's fault or whatever. So that's the older generation, unfortunately. So they've never been able to find the mainstream American voice. With the younger generation, and I should introduce you to my friend Peter, who's sitting right there. He's actually an Iranian American who sees these things very similarly to what I do, and is trying to organize. The problem is a lot of Iranian Americans who've never been to Iran, or they'll go back on little summer trips, and they're treated quite well, and because they're both by their own families and the broader society, it's always good to see they get this sort of hero's return kind of thing when they go back, or they've never been. And they're going through identity sort of questions in the same way that other diaspora communities, other immigrant groups are going through. And there's a risk for them to become they'll adopt a very Chomskyite worldview, either because they haven't experienced the repression in Iran firsthand, or they know that the Iranian regime is bad, but in order to defend their Iranian identity, they have to say, they have these very bifocal worldviews. Well, they'll say on the one hand, the regime is terrible, but they can't bring themselves to admit that, well, the way that the regime treats Iranians is the same way. So what, if Iranians are so fed up with the regimes, why would you think that Israelis, when they hear every other day like Israel should be annihilated, you know what I mean? They can't connect the dots. On the one hand, they probably think the Iranian regime is bad and there needs to be some form of change. On the other hand, they want to defend their identity here in this broader sort of soup, and so it's tough. But at least in 2009, when those things were happening, there was a great amount of intracommunal solidarity and people coming together that I think has fallen apart. The older people have gone back to their discussions about 1953, and the young people are becoming sort of strident and embattled and becoming sort of Chomskyite in mind about when it comes to foreign policy, even as they might say they hate the Iranian regime. So it's sad. Yeah.
I think it was Leon Aaron the Russia scholar at AEI. He wrote an article last year, I think it was, or maybe 2 years ago, and he wrote about how, you know, the U.S. engaged in economic warfare and tried to, you know, put pressure on the Soviet Union diplomatically. But in his opinion, the factor that really broke the Soviet Union's back was when they themselves, the Soviets, stopped believing in their own system. And that's when it really, that's what pushed it over the edge. So assuming that analysis is right, don't you think that, I want you to comment a little bit about how the U.S. can do a lot more via, for example, VOA Persian, and how it's been gutted the last 4 years. You yourself know many examples of how programming at VOA Persian has been changed.
VOA Persian is Voice of America.
How popular commentators, you know, anchors have been fired or not invited back. Just want your, because we were discussing how can we
and the same thing with Radio
regime
Liberty.
change.
Yeah.
Well, one of the basic ones is the VOA Persian, which had a lot more viewers 5-6 years ago than it does today. And that by itself, that VOA Persian being gutted is a bad signal to the Iranian people who actually enjoyed watching this as a good source of news. And then they see, for example, the show Parazit, the very popular one among young people, that's been canceled. I mean, it boggles the mind. How could such a popular show be canceled? So what is going on there, and how can we improve that? And do you think that that would provide encouragement to the people? One of the steps that would, you know, be positive.
So just so folks know the bigger reference, and I know we're running out of time here, but that's a great, I think it's a great practical policy sort of prescription to end on. Is Voice of America had this program called Parazit, which means like noise or interference,
yeah.
That's how Persians use it. And by the way, the reference to that is because the Iranian regime uses sort of satellite jamming signals to try to shut down radio and satellite signals that come into the country. Anywho, it was hailed as the Iranian answer to The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and in fact, the guys were once guests on The Daily Show because it's very obviously they'll play a news clip from an Iranian cleric saying women shouldn't play soccer, and then the guys will come on and rant at him, sort of in Jon Stewart style. By the way, I'm not a fan of Jon Stewart, but I appreciate it. I appreciate the television format that he put forward, because clearly young Iranians are really into it. And you know what? And the program was canceled inexplicably. In Voice of America and BBC Persian, it's funny because they're part of the reason they've become less effective is because of this push of, no, we're going to be an objective news outlet, and we're going to have equal time for equal views, as though the other side isn't pumping crazy, vile, anti-Semitic, Holocaust denial, misogynistic nonsense, right? And so what it takes to combat that is the same way we did with Radio Liberty back in the day, and also more new media forms. And yet this platform is stale. BBC Persian only has 5 hours of programming, whereas the regime has 24/7 multiple channels of propaganda. And so that's one easy thing. And by the way, the cost is so little compared to what we spend on PBS, by the way. It's something that...
Big Bird.
Let's leave Big Bird out of this.
No, I disagree with you. You said that they are objective. They're quite the opposite.
Right. In fact, so I think I'll let you speak to that, but I think what Peter wants to get at is they reflect the views of the Iranian reformists, who are establishment characters who are part of the regime, And what they have a beef with is Ahmadinejad. They'll say, oh, they'll never say the regime. They'll always say, this is a great sign to sort of, I think, morally sift people who are in the claim to be in the opposition in Iran, is if they'll say, this government is terrible. And when they say this government is terrible, what they're signaling is the regime is legitimate. Yes, we might need to tinker with the constitution, but as a whole, it's the past 8 years of repression. What they mean is Ahmadinejad. As though, you know, the biggest number of mass executions actually happened in the 80s. One of the biggest crackdowns on students happened in the 90s when there was a reformist president. So, I mean, I think that's what you're getting at, but yeah.
By the way, we're not running out of time. It's until 2.
Yeah.
Ah, okay, great. I thought it was 1:30. Okay, great.
I was wondering if you could clarify a bit more what the ideological conflict is, because I'm not really clear about it myself. And in particular, what is our weakness in that ideological conflict? What is it that the Iranian regime says to their people that's persuasive to them that we're a bad thing? What's the most powerful points of rhetoric they have against us? Because that's very hard for us to understand.
Great question. So, what is Khomeinism? Is the ideology, I would say, right? It's a form of Islamism that's specifically Shiite, and the idea is that there's we're nearing an end of times, and that the world is wrought with chaos and disorder, and we're waiting for the 12th Imam, who's in Shia. The difference, I'm sure you're familiar, but the difference between Shia and the Sunnis is primarily the Shia believe that it's the Prophet's direct blood descendants who are the heirs to, rule the Islamic world. And there were 11 of these descendants, and then the 12th one, I guess sort of like Moses, went into a state of millennial occultation in a well. He disappeared. And, he'll return to herald the apocalypse. But in the meanwhile, it's up to jurists who are, learned theologians, essentially, and jurisprudence to rule. So they essentially reject democracy. But the thing is, their revolution had leftist origins as well, and Republican origins, and so therefore they have to have, every 4 years they'll have elections for parliament and the presidency. But those bodies are not completely about mundane matters like traffic. I think they have power, but anything that actually has to do with the governing of the state, their decisions of the popular bodies are subject to the supreme leader's absolute veto, and they have other clerical bodies that are quasi-elected or completely unelected that try to maintain the supreme leader's supremacy. By the way, Peter and I always joke that these bodies have the most hilarious names. They sound like things out of like the Galactic Council. So it's the Guardian Council, which it's in charge of vetting candidates for the popular offices like the Parliament and presidency. There's something called the Expediency Council, which resolves differences between Parliament and the Supreme Leader's office, essentially. But the thing is, it's weird to take this stuff too seriously because it's a dictatorship, with religious trappings, where one man essentially and a clerical cohort around him get to say what's what, and they want to rule the Islamic world. The problem that they have is twofold. One is that they're Persians, whereas the vast majority of Muslims, at least in the region, not globally, but in the region, are Sunni and they're Arab. The other one is that the rest of the region, in some ways, has made peace with modernity. They may not have made peace with Israel. No, I shouldn't say they made peace with modernity. They've made peace with American power. The rulers, not the people are a different story, but the rulers have. What's different about the Iranian regime is essentially that they haven't made peace with an American order, keeping shipping lanes open in the Persian Gulf, maintaining the flow of oil, and they want to dislodge the U.S. and become the regional hegemon. But they really do have in their heads global ambitions. Now, Peter hinted at the fact that some of them have stopped believing this nonsense, but pretend to. I would say with the Iranian regime, and feel free to contest that, Peter, but I think the Iranian regime, there's still a core that really believes this stuff. I mean, I think Ahmadinejad really, really believes in this stuff. I mean, I think he's a sincere man.
So are you saying that their main problem with the United States is that we're proponents of democracy?
Yeah.
And so it's just democracy itself, and there's no bad consequences from democracy that they think would follow for, what do they scare their people with above democracy that makes them think democracy is a bad thing?
They'll say, there's a phrase that they'll use called, I'll say the Persian, it's Bohrana Azadi, which means the crisis of freedom. And, they essentially say, look at liberal democracy. It has, drug use. Although, by the way, what's funny is they have all these problems, but it's just hidden and repressed in the Iranian society. But they'll say democracy means drug use. It means, what do you mean freedom of speech? They can offend the most sacred things, right? So they will say that stuff.
So democracy means blasphemy.
It means blasphemy. It means
drugs,
and it means women who are far more immodest than they should be. This sort of thing. But what's funny is, and I look forward to this because the Egyptians, I think, are going in the same direction. They overthrew a secular dictator, and it was in part by secular forces, and in large part by Islamist forces, and it's the Islamist forces that have made at least the biggest short-term gains. And if they go through and set up 30 years of democracy, the result, I'm convinced, will be something like Iran, where after 30 years, Iranian women constantly want to push the boundary. They'll figure out how they can, with their headscarves, they'll push it back a little bit, and then occasionally the moral police essentially will come by and haul some of them off or slap some of them, and then as soon as they're gone, they'll be pushing it back. So I think I look forward to the Egyptians, feel the same, but and it's tragic that it seems like, at least right now, the popular will there is Islam is the answer. Yeah.
As far as I can tell, liberal democracy does mean blasphemy.
Yeah.
To a great extent, and with this in mind, what sort of a regime can we expect to be possible, and what would be? Might it not require a really sort of wholesale shift in, I guess, the religious outlook of Iran as a whole? And what could we do to make that happen? How's that?
Can I make a totally nakedly partisan and unrelated point based on that?
Sure.
You remember the speech President Obama gave to the United Nations, where in part in the aftermath of the stuff in Benghazi? It was really fascinating to me because, on the one hand, it was impressive because he defended. He put. I think it was an articulate. It was a thoughtful defense of why we have a pretty absolute right to freedom of speech. Except there was one cute little bit in it where he stopped and he said, "And you know what? The answer to bad speech we think is more speech, which is one of the classic defenses of the First Amendment. And here in the West, or in the U.S., I think, we rally against those voices of bigotry and blasphemy, which is very funny because essentially, it's this theory that so I don't know. That was a really interesting bit, but no, I mean, I think first of all, it sounded like I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name the first time. I think Jeff sounds like he knows somewhat about Islamic history. I don't know. I mean, if you're interested, but first of all, the region has a tradition of subtly blasphemous and like homoerotic poetry that, you know, and sadly a lot of those poets and so forth either, you know, coded their messages or, you know, were essentially were killed by the clerical class of the 10th century. So I would say, for what it's worth, that there is a kernel of free thinking in the Islamic sphere that goes back some ways, but it's always been sort of the repressed. It's always been. It's never been.
Let me ask.
Sure.
Are they really so religious? I remember reading some statement from one of their spokesmen to the effect that we're stronger than the West because we're not afraid to die.
Mm-hmm.
You're the party of life, we're the party of death.
Mm-hmm.
And this makes us stronger and gives us a stronger will.
Mm-hmm.
And when I heard that, I began to hear a little Nietzsche and wonder whether they were using their religion to strengthen their will or strengthening their will to promote their religion.
Do you mean the general populace, or you mean the regime leaders?
Yeah, perhaps the regime leaders,
Yeah.
or whoever.
I mean, Shiism has a huge culture of martyrdom. The hero of Shiism was the third imam down that line of 12, Hussein, who, you know, essentially the Sunni head of the Muslim world at the time, the Caliph, you know, cornered him, and there were, you know, 70. You know, Hussein and his companions were 70, and this army was thousands or whatever, and, you know, they were slaughtered to the last. And the entire sort of drama of Hussein is of you're outnumbered, you're outgunned, but your sheer sort of love of death, your embrace of death, you're being unafraid about death. And this stuff, you know, that's how they withstood. I mean, Iraq was militarily superior, and they fought for, you know, they fought for 2 years, and then you know, there was an opportunity to end the war, but Khomeini said, no, we'll be in Baghdad in whatever many hours, and it took 6 more years of, you know, senseless killing. Like, you know, 500,000 or so Iranians died, and you've probably heard the stories of they would give the keys, the plastic keys to the kids, saying, you know, this is your key to heaven, run across the minefield. That's how they cleared Iraqi minefields. So there is that element. And that's the scary thing, is that the Iranians, not to go back to the populace, the Iranians who are our allies, or who are the dissidents, they're post-Islamists, right? They've either experienced the West, they aspire to the West, and so you know, they're like, they'll come out into the street, but if it gets bloody, they're like, oh, screw this. I mean, I'm going back home. You know, like, they don't, you know, whereas, and so if you notice, the Iranian uprising didn't last that long, whereas notice that the uprising in Syria, which has a strong Islamist dimension, and it's you know, it's martyrdom or freedom, you know. So that's a big problem they'll face. Yeah, Jeff.
Well, I just wanted to kind of talk about, I think this is an interesting point, this distinction between, like, what is the problem with democracy in the minds of a lot of these people. And I think there's just a profound misunderstanding on their part of what democracy is. I mean, I've been involved pretty closely with this question in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran. And, you know, I think I took a class with Abdul Karim Soroush in Chicago.
Yeah.
I'm sure y'all know who Soroush is. He's an Iranian.
In fact, the crisis of freedom, I think, might be something he coined.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, though.
I think it might be. It seems like something he would say. But it was interesting, because in that class, we were talking, it was an intellectual history of modern Iran, and he drew a dichotomy of governments on the board, and he said that governments are either hedayat or rezayat, which means either their leadership, they're like they're leading the people, or they exist for the pleasure of the people. And it was like, and which one is the United States? Of course, from our perspective, it's an impossible question to answer, because government is not intended either to lead the people or to serve the pleasures of the people. But I think that's part of the problem, is that dichotomy. So I think when they look at democracy, I think the traditional Islamic political theory is to lead toward hedayat. And then so they look at democracy and they try to fit it into that schema. And they see the only way that can go is toward rezayat, you know, which would basically be in their minds anarchy. So I think this where this part of the crisis comes in, is I think a lot of it is in part miscommunication and misunderstanding exactly what what the principles are. But it's interesting, particularly in the Iranian case, because you mentioned, it sounds like Nietzsche and Hegel. Well, Ali Shariati, of course, used Nietzsche and Hegel all the time. He was one of the big kind of drummers, not necessarily for the revolution itself, because he was killed before 79. He was killed in 76 or 78.
77.
77. But yeah, so he drew on all of this, and which is, I think,
He was the first sort of Islamo-Marxist.
And which is interesting because the roots of the revolution,
crazy.
you know, I mean, are Western in a sense, in the sense that a lot of the ideas are recaptured Western philosophy, recapitulated within an Iranian and Persian framework.
I haven't not much more to add other than it's worthwhile to see where Soroush is now. This was one of the regime's chief sort of theoreticians, ideologues, and I don't know where. I mean, people say he's come quite a ways from that. Obviously, is he still at Chicago? He was at Harvard for a while too.
No, well, so he's a peripatetic wanderer. I think he's like got a permanent position in Maryland, but he
is a member.
I think he spends pretty much a semester or a quarter, depending on your system, is in various universities, just constantly moving around.
I mean,
he's in charge of purging the educational system.
Oh yeah, he led the Cultural Revolution, which is Iran's Cultural Revolution. Yeah, which just it amazes me that, I mean, the guy has a platform. The elite American universities have to bring in every Iranian former, because they come in as reformers now. But like, the guy has a platform. It doesn't have to be a university one, funded in part by American tax dollars sometimes. But yeah.
And I apologize. I have to leave a little bit early,
Sure.
so
No
I
worries.
to ask a question, just maybe to take a different tact. I mean, this isn't my argument. This was Mark Stein made this argument, and other people have made it as well, that reform in the fight against Muslim fundamentalism as an ideological worldwide struggle, that the idea of reforming Islam is problematic because the reform of Christianity, which took place, was accomplished by political philosophers who were atheists, but who used a kind of Trojan horse method. They basically said, well, we're going to purify Christianity, improve it, get rid of inter-Christian warfare, create better Christians. And maybe they partly meant that, and maybe they said, or maybe we're going to create a lot of unbelieving, commercial salesmen, but either way is okay with us. And at this point, or even in the 50s, Sari Kutub goes to Colorado Springs, a very radical bohemian place, and he was horrified. And so at this point, in modern history, the Islamic leadership sees clearly that this reform really does lead to widespread atheism.
Yeah.
So in a way, isn't their assessment on this point, I don't know, their assessment of Muhammad being the true prophet is different, but on this point, aren't they correct? Isn't it a bit of a Trojan horse and it won't work again? Aren't we faced with this reform problem that, it really does lead to all of these morally lax behaviors that they're against, and you can't sell them the same formula. So this seems to be like a new kind of problem that we didn't have with the Soviets, who were kind of like, whoa, we're ultra-democratic, we're like you.
Right.
Kind of like, we're like you, and everybody's Western, everybody's democratic, everybody's scientific.
Yeah.
We know the right way. You guys are kind of,
We're more scientific.
but with the Islamists, in a way, they're right. They've got our number, maybe. We have a bit of, I don't know. That would be kind of the opposite tact. I don't know, and do you agree with that?
Well, the way that because I look, in the long term, I think that there is something malignant in pieces of Islam that need reform. But I think the way that reformers in the region had previously tried to do it, like Ataturk and Reza Shah in Iran, is essentially to decimate the clerical class and violently impose secularism. I think that that doesn't work. We've gone through that, and Iran is ruled by Islamists today, and Turkey is, as soon as they have a chance to vote, they vote for Islamists. So in some sense, what I'm saying is that there has to be some deeper reform. I I'm with, I don't know if you read Ruel Marc Gerecht. He was a CIA operative and was smuggled into Iran. But he writes pretty widely. And he believes that ultimately, in part, this will have to be done by the religious figures coming to terms somehow and changing the doctrines or finessing the doctrines in the same way, in some ways as the Reformation and so forth. I just don't think that those people are Qaradawi. In other words, or in Iran, Khatami or whoever. I think that those people are still too committed to revolutionary Islamism. But I don't think I wouldn't say that it's not going to happen. But I wouldn't promote the current crop of Islamist so-called reformers like what's his name? I reviewed his book, Tariq Ramadan, and other. I mean, I think they're not genuine reformers. Yeah.
But then I'm now completely perplexed by what you're saying. It needs to come from within the clerical class, and there needs to be basically, I don't know, a Luther in Iran that has strong charisma, is vastly intelligent, is a legislator. These people come along, I don't know, once every couple hundred years. There's nothing you can do to prepare that, to force that. So what do you mean by regime change?
No. I mean I was addressing his bigger point about just the problem of Islamism, right? Like not just.
Sure, but that is the problem
right. In the meanwhile, they're driving toward the ones that are there right now are getting closer and closer to a nuclear weapon. May already have it, and we just don't know. And they threaten our interests. And so in the meanwhile, we have to, we have to come up with solutions that. We have to go to war with the army we have, so to speak.
Change first, you mean something kind of superficial, those like get the bad guys.
Right. But as I was saying,
but then you're saying that in Egypt now they're leading back towards Islam. In Turkey, they whenever they get a chance. So I just don't understand what the perspective is on regime change in Iran, because everything you're saying seems to always point back to, well, it'll come back unless there's a fundamental theological reform that spreads widely, because it's done by someone who has this power of conviction that American propaganda or Western propaganda will never have, because they see the consequences.
But in Iran, that a substantial, perhaps a sufficient but not necessary number of people, like average people, because the Turks haven't yet lived on under a true sort of Islamist theocracy, and nor have the Egyptians. In fact, Islamists in power, besides Iran, and I guess the Taliban in Afghanistan, revolutionary type Islamists of the type that threaten us the most. There haven't been many experiments of trying to build societies around these ideals, except for Iran. And in Iran, after 30 years, at least a number of people will say, I don't want to cover my hair. I don't want to hold back what I want to say in the public sphere. So, so Iran is in some sense progressed further along. My response was the question over here was just this bigger point that at some point for this Islamism problem to go away, in part it'll have to do in part with the the theologians and genuine reformers within Islam. I'm not conversant with those texts. I've maintained 2 prayers that you learn when you're a kid of Quranic prayers. That's it. I'm not, so I won't change Islam from within, and nor will the people who call themselves the secular types. But the people who are conversant with the text, if we want this problem to go away in the long term, they have to be part of the solution. That's what I'm saying. But in the meanwhile, Iran, a substantial number of people have made the transition, and meanwhile the regime threatens us, and regime change is a serious option. Yeah.
You've addressed most of my questions, but I just had two points. One is I'm still a little bit confused. At some point you described it as a dictatorship with religious trappings, and at some point you've said things that make it sound more like a dictatorship of religious finesse. Seems, I'm not sure exactly which direction you come down on there. So if you could just clarify, and then not directly related point, I'm just wondering, as someone who's lived in both Iran and the U.S., you know, what the way of life of the typical Iranian versus the typical American, is there anything to be said for the typical Iranian way of life? I mean, is it simply a matter of lack of enlightenment, that they really have no idea how much worse it really is there, or is there something to their way of life that we lack some reasonable basis, you know, some grounds on which they're rejecting us? I mean, you know, you could say, you know, if you think of the American, you know, going to work all day, coming home, plopping down on the TV, overeating. I mean, these kind of things. They're, you know, there are criticisms one could make of our way of life. You know, are they really just? Does it seem like a palpably bad way of life, or is there anything to be said for it? Since if we want to push them so hard in our direction.
As the first question, what I meant when I was answering Jeff is that they're not traditionalists. In other words, they're messianic. Some of them truly believe the crazy stuff about the apocalypse, and they're willing to discard the trappings of tradition, like, you know, the sacredness of an ayatollah's opinions, and interfere with that when it's necessary, because they believe in sort of the messianic vision of their state. So I think those two aren't contradictory. The second thing, I'm not the best spokesperson for, because I do like, I mean, it's, yeah, the people are closer. I think the families are larger. When people get old, I think, you know, Iranians take care of them and so forth. But on the whole, I mean, I think when I was in Iran, I was, you know, very much, you know, into G.I. Joe and the Transformers. You know what I mean? Like I never thought it was that great. Yeah. So, but are there things to be said for Persian, or the Persian, or the Iran, or even the, you know, Islamic way of life? Yeah, I'm sure. But as a way of governance, it's another story. Yeah.
But haven't we come to the most interesting point here? I mean, when you're situated at the Wall Street Journal, you may not see it to the same degree, but just listen to the trend of this conversation. The fact of the matter is, are there convictions here in America today? Are there spokesmen for the American way of life? Is there an appreciation for what this country has achieved? I don't know whether it's ever been at so low a point.
There's Professor Mansfield.
Well, I know Professor Mansfield, but you know, I'm also an acquired, come to this country, and it was always my last hope in a way, first and last hope. And I'm amazed in the 20 years that I've been here at the erosion of self-confidence, of moral self-confidence in this country. And if there's no one here who can articulate it, and if there's absolutely no conviction that we are better in some way, and this way of life and this way of governance is superior, you cannot make the case, then that's the answer to your question. Then, of course, the other side will have those convictions. And, you know, that's been said by great poets before, that, you know, it's the worst who have, you know, the greatest convictions. So, you know, so I mean, I think the case can be made to Iranians. I don't, if it's not made by the other side, if it's not persuasively, you know, conveyed in some sense, then clearly the war is lost, and it doesn't have to do with, you know, with your strategies alone. It goes much deeper.
Right. No, agreed. Yeah.
I'm talking about the youth now. For the percentage that want to keep the status quo, that wouldn't be into liberal reform, do they reflect the same reasons for that as the older population? So would it be a religious, political democracy thing, or is it more historical with 1953 or 78, 79, or is it a different reason than the older population?
Of why they're
why they don't want reform, why they want to keep the status quo?
Of young people?
What percentage? Of young people that aren't into
Oh, right,
change.
who aren't.
I mean,
I
not,
think
not 100% would be into
Yeah.
change. So for that percentage that aren't, do they reflect the older population, or is it for different reasons?
Well, look, there's it's worthwhile to look at the Basij, who are the regime's they're essentially they're paramilitias, right? They're vigilante militias who, whenever there is protest by the seculars, these are the guys who are called out. They'll go into movie theaters and beat people up and the like. For the people who join it, and the number is pretty huge, because it's not just the actual member of the Basij or mobilization force, what it means. It's also the family that's surrounding that person. So if there's maybe, the estimates vary. The Iranian regime says there's 10 million. Much more likely there's like 300,000 active, I believe, and then a network of 1 to 3 million alumni of that force. For those people who typically they do come from the more impoverished backgrounds, going into the Basij, in a society that even before the revolution it's more caste sort of stratified than even class, right? You don't even propose to a girl or even think to propose to a girl, although that's slightly changing too. But for a lot of people, it's like there's just these strict caste divides. So you don't go to you don't even think about someone who's not who's not one of you or not. So for those people, and often they're deprived of opportunity, joining the Basij, the mobilization force, it opens a lot of doors to what sort of university courses you can take, that otherwise people from sort of the urban poor or the rural poor wouldn't have access to. So there is, a large percentage of people who fit into that category that you described, who it's a way of life. It feeds them. The regime has all that oil money, and one of the big things that it does is it dispenses it to people and buys their loyalty. And meanwhile, you're getting the sort of the brainwashing and you're told that the West is a terrible place of drug addiction and prostitution and blasphemy. So and so for those people, I think that's one of the reasons why it's really, if there is a scenario of the next uprising and more people, let's say, supported because of what they've seen in Syria, there is a real likelihood of pure sort of communal bloodletting, because these are the people where if you were a guy and you were holding your girlfriend's hand, these guys will come up to you and slap you in the face in public, and you can't do it. You know what I mean? You've been humiliated. And everyone knows who the Basijis in their neighborhoods are. And if we don't manage what that transition is like, I really think these are some of the most hated people in the country, even by people who may be religious. There are members of the religious establishment whose sons or daughters have been killed in that 2009 period by these people, and a lot of them, I would say, are just locked into this life because there's no other opportunity in the society. Imagine what could happen in terms of bloodletting. So that's a really good class of people to watch, is where they come from, why do they believe what they do, and what do you do with them if there's a transitional scenario. Yep.
I like to hear you using the word manage. That you can see a scenario in which if you were in power and Congressman Ryan didn't have to shut up and not answer Martha's questions, and you're actually able to say what he might do instead of this wasn't done, mistakes were made. If you were actually the one speaking to him and advising him, what more could be done apart from beefing up Voice of America and BBC? I'd like to hear 16, 17 ideas about what we're going to do moving forward, given that I hope maybe that's going to be the position of power you're going to assume.
Oh, no, I'm not interested in seeking political.
Or someone who knows you, or Peter.
Okay, yeah, Peter.
I just want to add to that. I think whatever policies the U.S. government adopts eventually, all those policies have to flow from the idea that we need to change this narrative. We need to appeal to this younger generation. We need to talk to them directly. We need to encourage them, and reassure them that they're not going to be abandoned. So, I think, whatever policies that are adopted needs to flow from that essential theme, that the narrative needs to be changed, because what happens is that the U.S. government focuses on a nuclear program, says as if these other issues don't count, as if you just give up your nuclear program, everything's fine. Well, everything's not fine, and we need to change that narrative. And I think that's a really important step forward, because at this point, we've had heavy-duty international sanctions. We move our fleet to the Persian Gulf, we beef it up, then we withdraw it, then we go back in. I mean, I think, in my opinion, this narrative is the thing that will break them at the end. But I could be wrong. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but that's what I think. And I think Sohrab agrees with that as well.
Let's hope it isn't wishful thinking, though Machiavelli says when people swear that to defend you with their lives, they generally do so when death is at a distance. So I would like, before we thank our guest, I would like to mention a couple of our future events, and one is right next week when we're having Lorraine Clark come talk on Jane Austen. We're having 3 meetings this fall on politics and literature. So Jane Austen, Shakespeare, and Homer are all going to be featured. And the one on Jane Austen, which is right away next Friday, is going to be on a novel of hers which happens to be called Mansfield Park. So if any of you wanted to read this novel, that would be an excellent preparation for the talk which is to come. And if you do that, try to figure out what Mansfield Park stands for. Anyway, so thank you so much, Sohrab. It's very good to have you.
Thank you very much.